Liam Delgado had always taken pride in cultivating his little slice of paradise. A former botanist turned organic farmer, Liam's property was his sanctuary, a lush backyard vineyard bursting with juicy grapes that he tended with both scientific precision and heartfelt passion. For Liam, his vines were more than just a crop. They were a symbol of years of dedication and the embodiment of a lifestyle that celebrated nature over corporate efficiency. Nestled in a quiet suburban enclave, Liam's home was a vibrant oasis amid cookie-cutter lawns and manicured hedges. The grapevines, winding along trellises and draping over rustic wooden arbors, lent the property an air of old-world charm. Every harvest was a labor of love, a time when the community would gather for impromptu tastings and laughter, reinforcing the bonds of a close-knit neighborhood. But not everyone shared Liam's appreciation for natural beauty or for his unorthodox approach to property management. Enter Kerren, the self-appointed queen of the Maple Grove Estates HOA. With her perfectly pressed blouses, a clipboard always in hand, and a glare that could curdle fresh milk, Kerren was the living embodiment of entitlement. To her, every element of the neighborhood had to conform to a pristine, sanitized standard. And when word spread that Liam's grapes were disappearing overnight, Kerren's sense of order was shattered. One crisp morning, as Liam inspected his vineyard, he discovered that clusters of his prized grapes were missing, stolen in broad daylight. Moments later, Kerren appeared at his gate, her tone as icy as her reputation. "Mr. Delgado, I must insist that you secure your property immediately," she snapped. "It has come to our attention that your unsecured grapes are encouraging unsavory behavior in our community." Liam frowned, puzzled and indignant. "Kerren, my grapes are meant to be shared. I invite neighbors to enjoy them. It's part of our community's spirit." But Kerren's eyes flashed with disapproval. "Sharing is not an excuse for negligence," she retorted. "Your lack of security is a violation of community standards. I'm issuing you a formal warning. If these grapes keep disappearing, there will be consequences." A small group of onlookers had gathered, their hushed voices mingling with the rustle of the grape leaves. In that moment, the serene rhythm of Liam's world was disrupted by the first crack in the facade of HOA perfection. For Liam, it wasn't merely about missing fruit. It was a declaration that his way of life was under attack by an institution more interested in rigid control than genuine community values. As Kerren strode away, heels clicking like the ticking of an impending deadline, Liam's resolve solidified. He wasn't about to let an entitled bureaucrat dictate how he managed his vineyard or how he shared the bounty of his labor. Unbeknownst to Kerren, a spark of defiance was lit in Liam's heart, one that would soon set him on a collision course with the very institution that prized conformity above creativity. The day after the confrontation, Liam opened his mailbox to find a formal notice bearing the official seal of the Maple Grove Estates HOA. The document detailed a $750 fine for violating community-produced security protocols. It was a dense, legalistic paper filled with regulations that, on their face, had no footing in local law. Leaning against his grape-laden trellis, Liam read the fine in disbelief as Kerren's voice echoed in his mind. Outside, Kerren stood with her arms folded, her expression one of smug superiority. "Remember, Mr. Delgado," she said coolly, "the rules are for everyone. Your negligence affects the entire community." Determined not to be bullied, Liam visited the local zoning office later that day. Armed with records of his sustainable practices and certifications for organic produce, he explained the situation to a sympathetic official. "There's no ordinance here that prohibits responsible produce sharing," the officer assured him, cautioning only that the HOA often interpreted community guidelines in a creative fashion. But despite this assurance, Kerren's campaign was in full swing. That very week, unannounced inspectors began arriving at Liam's property. They measured the gaps in the fencing, checked the perimeter of the vineyard, and questioned him about his security measures, all in a tone that made it clear that compliance was not optional but mandatory. Each visit, though wrapped in the veneer of routine inspections, felt more like a personal indictment of his lifestyle. Later that evening, an emergency HOA meeting was convened in the community center. Kerren took to the podium with her customary air of authority, outlining new regulations designed to ensure that every homeowner adhered to the community's vision of order. Effective immediately, she declared, any homeowner found neglecting security protocols will be subject to further fines and possible legal action. The words were delivered with such finality that a murmur of apprehension spread through the room. Liam sat in the back, a mixture of frustration and determination swirling within him. The fine wasn't just a financial penalty. It was an affront to his way of life. Every grape he nurtured, every vine he pruned, was an expression of his freedom. And now, Kerren's arbitrary demands threatened to strip that away. That night, as Liam reviewed the fine and the notes from the zoning office, he vowed silently that he would not let the HOA's overreach crush his spirit. He would document every inconsistency, every baseless rule, and every act of intimidation. In doing so, he would not only defend his vineyard, but also the right of every homeowner to live freely without the shadow of tyrannical oversight. In the days that followed, Kerren's tactics evolved from fines to more insidious measures. Neighbors began to whisper about similar incidents, complaints about minor landscaping, disputes over paint colors, and even claims that missing items weren't accidental, but part of a larger scheme of enforced conformity. Leah, meanwhile, discovered an unsettling pattern. Several residents had reported that their prized possessions had vanished, only to reappear in odd places around the neighborhood. Determined to uncover the truth behind the theft of his grapes, Liam set up discreet cameras around his vineyard. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he reviewed the footage. It wasn't long before he noticed shadowy figures slipping through the rows of vines, figures that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. But what struck him most was that these furtive visits always occurred on nights following HOA meetings, when Kerren's rhetoric was at its peak. Liam began documenting every incident, compiling what he called the Vineyard Vigil files. Alongside video clips, he gathered testimonials from neighbors who, in hushed tones over backyard fences, admitted they had also suffered mysterious losses. A trusted board member, disillusioned by Kerren's growing authoritarianism, confided in Liam that fines and voluntary donations were often exchanged for turning a blind eye to such thefts. The implication was clear. Kerren's motives were less about preserving community standards and more about consolidating power, and perhaps even personal gain. The tension in Maple Grove Estates grew palpable. During informal gatherings at the local cafe and in hushed conversations by the community center, residents shared their frustrations and fears about a regime that seemed to target those who dared to be different. Liam's vineyard, once a symbol of natural abundance and community warmth, was now at the center of an escalating conflict. Late one night, as Liam reviewed yet another set of incriminating images, he resolved that the time for silent suffering was over. He would not only defend his grapes, but expose the corruption festering within the HOA. The evidence was mounting, and the community's discontent was reaching a fever pitch. Kerren's methods, stealing, fining, and intimidating, could no longer be allowed to stand unchecked. Liam's determination crystallized into a plan, a counterattack that would use the very tools of silent judgment against Kerren. But even as he prepared his next move, he knew that the stakes were higher than just a vineyard. They were about reclaiming the right to live authentically in a community that had grown too afraid to challenge its own overseer. One cool morning, Liam awoke to a sight that made his blood boil. His beloved grapevines had been partially uprooted, the trellises torn down, and the ground around his vineyard scarred by heavy machinery. Kerren had declared an urgent safety inspection, a thinly veiled pretext to justify the destruction of his cherished property. It was a direct message: comply or suffer the consequences. Armed with his Vineyard Vigil files and a stack of municipal documents, Liam marched to the next HOA meeting. In the crowded community center, where anxious homeowners had gathered under the oppressive watch of Kerren's enforcers, Liam took the stage. His voice rang out clear and firm as he began, "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see are the facts. Our community is being held hostage by arbitrary rules and unchecked authority." He projected video clips of shadowy figures among his vines, images of inspectors measuring distances, and even snippets of hushed boardroom conversations hinting at financial misconduct. The room fell into a heavy silence as the evidence was laid bare. One by one, homeowners began to murmur their own grievances, stories of unjust fines and invasive inspections that had become all too common. Kerren, sitting at the front with a look of barely concealed fury, tried to interject. "These accusations are completely unfounded," she declared, her voice wavering as she clutched her clipboard. But the mounting evidence left little room for denial. The crowd's discontent grew louder, and even some of Kerren's longtime allies began to cast doubtful glances her way. Emboldened by the overwhelming support, Liam continued, "This isn't just about stolen grapes or damaged property. It's about our right to live without fear of arbitrary power. We deserve transparency and fairness." His words resonated with the homeowners, many of whom had quietly suffered under Kerren's oppressive regime for far too long. The meeting erupted into a chorus of approval. As neighbors shared their own experiences of abuse and injustice, Kerren's authority began to crumble before everyone's eyes. The very same rules she had wielded to control the community were now turning against her, exposing a system riddled with corruption and favoritism. That day, as Liam left the community center to a tide of supportive smiles and encouraging words, he knew the battle was far from over, but the momentum was shifting. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and the community was beginning to awaken from its enforced silence. Kerren's iron grip was loosening, and the truth of her misdeeds was taking root. Cornered by the relentless evidence and a growing chorus of dissent, Kerren escalated her tactics to desperate extremes. One humid evening, determined to regain control, she made a bold decision. She would involve the police. Kerren phoned 911, alleging that the mysterious thefts and disturbances at Liam's vineyard were causing a public nuisance that endangered the community's safety. Within minutes, uniformed officers arrived at Liam's property. Calmly, Liam greeted them, brandishing his city official credentials and explaining, "There's no public disturbance here, just a misunderstanding of community sharing and a few misplaced grapes." The officers, clearly bemused by the situation, left with only a warning to Kerren about misusing emergency services. Not willing to concede defeat, Kerren resorted to even more covert measures. Later that night, she hired a private investigator, hoping to catch Liam in a compromising situation that would justify further legal action. However, as fate would have it, Liam's newly installed security cameras captured every move. The footage clearly showed the investigator sneaking through the vineyard, an unmistakable act of trespassing and intimidation. Armed with this damning evidence, Liam decided it was time for a masterstroke, a countermove that would turn Kerren's own tactics against her. Drawing on the quiet wisdom of an unlikely ally, he reached out to Mrs. Evelyn Harper, a kindly grandmother renowned throughout the neighborhood for her gentle demeanor and unflappable sense of justice. Evelyn, who had long been a silent observer of Kerren's overreach, agreed to lend her quiet authority to Liam's cause. At the next HOA meeting, a session that Kerren had expected to use to reassert her control, Liam introduced the unexpected guest. In a soft but resolute voice, Mrs. Harper took the stage. "I've seen a lot in my 80 years, she began, her eyes twinkling with quiet indignation, "and I know when someone is taking advantage of others. I'm here to silently judge this behavior and remind us all that decency and respect matter more than arbitrary rules." Her words, delivered with the gentle firmness of a seasoned matriarch, resonated deeply with the assembled homeowners. Just as Kerren tried to interject with a flurry of legal jargon and angry accusations, Liam played the security footage on a large screen. The room filled with gasps as everyone saw the investigators' furtive actions. Kerren's face turned a deep shade of red as her final desperate gambit was laid bare for all to see. In that charged moment, the combination of evidence and Mrs. Harper's silent but powerful judgment proved too much. Kerren's authority, already in question, now teetered on the brink of collapse. Her final, desperate move had backfired spectacularly, and the community's united response was unmistakable. Enough was enough. The fallout from the dramatic showdown was swift and decisive. At an emergency meeting convened by a coalition of fed-up homeowners, the air was thick with resolve and righteous indignation. With the damning evidence displayed for all to see and Mrs. Harper's dignified condemnation still echoing in every heart, the community voted overwhelmingly to oust Kerren from the HOA board. The decision sent shockwaves through Maple Grove Estates. Within days, local authorities launched an investigation into the HOA's practices, uncovering a pattern of arbitrary fines, misuse of funds, and blatant abuse of power. The very structure of the HOA, once a tool of control, began to crumble as transparency replaced tyranny. For Kerren, the repercussions were immediate and severe. Her home, once a symbol of her authority, was suddenly thrust into the public market, and the financial mismanagement that had long been concealed came to light. The relentless public scrutiny and the legal actions that followed reduced her influence to nothing more than a cautionary tale of unchecked entitlement. Meanwhile, Liam watched from his vineyard-turned-sanctuary as the oppressive regime that had threatened his way of life was dismantled piece by piece. Neighbors, emboldened by their collective victory, began sharing stories of past grievances and openly questioning the old rules. What had once been a climate of fear and silence transformed into a vibrant dialogue about fairness, community, and respect for individuality. Sitting on his porch one evening, Liam sipped his coffee and surveyed the reclaimed neighborhood with quiet satisfaction. The vineyard, once targeted by arbitrary fines and covert thefts, now stood as a beacon of resilience and community spirit. Kerren's fall from grace had not only liberated him, but had sparked a movement that redefined what it meant to live in Maple Grove Estates. With the community's uprising now in full swing, local authorities had no choice but to dismantle the remnants of the corrupt HOA. Investigations into the arbitrary fines and invasive inspections led to substantial legal repercussions. The city imposed heavy fines on the HOA for enforcing non-existent regulations, and a class action lawsuit was promptly filed on behalf of the wronged homeowners. At a press conference held in the revitalized community center, Liam addressed a crowd of relieved residents and reporters. "Today, we've proven that no one is above the law," he stated calmly. "Our community will no longer live under the shadow of arbitrary authority." His measured words marked a turning point, a final power move against the vestiges of tyranny that had once reigned unchecked. As court dates were set and legal documents piled up, individual board members began facing their own legal battles. Even Kerren's longtime legal advisor found himself under investigation for his role in perpetuating the HOA's abuses. The collapse of the old system was not just symbolic, it was a legal reckoning that sent a clear message to communities everywhere. Fairness and transparency would always prevail over entitlement. For Liam, the culmination of these legal victories was a validation of his long-fought battle. The class action lawsuit not only promised financial restitution, but also paved the way for a complete overhaul of community governance. Maple Grove Estates, once marred by fear and rigid conformity, was now on the path to a future defined by respect, collaboration, and true community spirit. As the legal and public consequences mounted, Kerren's personal life unraveled in spectacular fashion. Once the formidable enforcer of Maple Grove Estates' rigid rules, she soon found herself isolated and ridiculed. The viral sensation of her misdeeds, combined with the quiet, damning judgment of Mrs. Harper, had transformed her into a figure of mockery rather than authority. Her prized sedan, once a symbol of her status, was repossessed amid mounting debts and fines. Rumors of marital strife quickly spread, and whispers of a bitter divorce became common chatter among neighbors. The once powerful Kerren was now the subject of endless jokes and memes, an ironic downfall for someone who had prided herself on her unyielding enforcement of the rules. In a final twist of fate, Kerren attempted to salvage her reputation by seeking employment in the property management field. But her new position, an entry-level role as an assistant property manager for another HOA, served as the ultimate punchline. At a community networking event, a former neighbor couldn't resist a parting shot. "I hope you enjoy following the rules now, Kerren." The remark, laced with both humor and scorn, perfectly encapsulated her complete collapse. Liam, watching these developments from the peaceful sanctuary of his vineyard, felt a deep sense of poetic justice. His fight wasn't just about protecting his grapes. It was about defending the right to live authentically without fear of arbitrary power. Kerren's downfall, public and unyielding, stood as a powerful reminder that entitlement, when unchecked, inevitably leads to ruin. In the months following Kerren's demise, Maple Grove Estates blossomed into a community defined by unity, creativity, and genuine respect for individual freedom. The oppressive era of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections was replaced by a renewed spirit of collaboration and open dialogue. Homeowners now gathered at block parties, on sunlit porches, and in newly reformed community centers to celebrate their collective victory. Liam, still tending his vibrant vineyard and sharing the bounty of his grapes with neighbors, became a local symbol of resistance and hope. At a festive neighborhood gathering, a cheerful resident presented him with a handmade HOA violation notice for excessive grape sharing. Laughter rang out as Liam held the sign high and replied with a wry smile, "They really tried." As dusk settled over Maple Grove Estates, the memory of Kerren's tyrannical rule faded into a distant echo. The community had reclaimed not only its rights, but also its spirit, one where humor, resilience, and freedom prevailed over entitlement. In that final golden moment of celebration, as neighbors exchanged stories and laughter filled the warm evening air, the screen of a once oppressive era faded to black, a final mic drop that signaled the triumph of a community united by truth and the simple joy of sharing grapes.